Don't mind, by the way. I think I'd rather be warm today than really cold. But this was so that I could plow and do whatever we need to do outside, which I still haven't succeeded at, but hopefully after service we will. But we're in Parsha Vayera, which is Exodus chapter 6 and verse 2, all the way through Exodus chapter 9 and verse 35. And so this is the passage where the Jews are getting ready to come out of Egypt. They're in bondage, they're crying out to God, they're struggling, they're in a lot of troubles. And so here in this, in Parsha Vayera, they're wanting to leave Israel, and God is about to do that. He's going to bring the 10 plagues upon them. And of course, we could talk about the 10 plagues, but I'm more interested in a few of the words that are used today. And so we're going to just read the first 4 verses of, well, not the first 4 verses, I guess the beginning of the Parsha Vayera. We're going to read Exodus chapter 6:5 all the way through Exodus 6 verse 8. And it says this in your Word of God, "And I have also heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage." And as you know, many times when we're reading the Word of God, especially when we're reading storylines, God is not just telling us a story to help us. Oftentimes, He's giving us a picture of something else He wants us to understand. And I think that that's also what's happening here. I think God is trying to give us a picture here through Israel, a picture of what He does for us at our salvation. And because that's something that we've been covering in our discipleship classes on Sunday morning and Sunday school, I thought this would be appropriate to hit this now while we're in this particular Parsha, because it relates to what we're talking about in our discipleship class on Sunday mornings. And so he says here, he says that he's heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Now this week, as some of you know, my daughter and my son-in-law and my little grandson, my wonderful little grandson, Lincoln Hunter, who is now, is he 2 months old? No, not quite, no. I think it's still another week till he's 2 months old. But anyway, he's cute as a button. I get to see him every few days. But he and my son-in-law and my daughter are now in Hawaii. They're at Kaneohe Marine Corps Base in Kaneohe, Hawaii. And you say, why is that special? That's special to me as the pastor here because that's where I got born again. And my daughter, actually, when I was calling her the other day, she said, "Dad, I can't talk right now. I'm at church." And I said, "Oh, okay," because she wasn't able to find a good church while she was in California, but now she's in Hawaii. And so I got to talk to her later in the day, and I said, "Where did you go?" And she said, "To the church you got saved at." And I said, "Wonderful! And how was that?" And she said, "It was a really good service." She said she enjoyed it. I said, "How did Lincoln take it?" And she said, he was kind of indifferent. He didn't squawk or anything. He just looked around the entire service. But I guess they asked her at the end of the service, what brought you here to us out of the blue? We don't know who you are or anything. And she said, "My dad became a Christian here when he was in the Army 40 years ago." And so they actually looked it up in their record book, just like we have a record book of this congregation upstairs. They looked it up in the record book, and they took a picture of it and showed it to my daughter the day I got baptized, which was the 15th of April, 1984. And so they took a picture of that record page in their record book and gave it to my daughter. And so she sent it to me yesterday from her visiting there. And so I thought it kind of goes along with this topic that we're hitting here, where he says in verse 5, "I have heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant." And I will never forget the day that I first went to Ko'olau Baptist Church in Kaneohe, Hawaii. And you say, why? Because at that point in time, I had been searching for God for about a year. And I know that there are some, they're going to fault me online. It's all right. You can fault me. I don't care. They say, well, you can't search for God. Yes, you can. It's both ways. You can't seek God out unless God draws you. But once He's drawing you, you most certainly have that ability to seek for God, to search for God, and I was. And I had been searching for Him for over a year. I had already visited the Mormon group. I'd already visited the JWs. I'd already visited the Christian Scientists and many other people. And you say, why? Because I was unsettled and I knew that God was out there. I just couldn't find Him. And I started talking to anybody that was religious looking for truth. And you say, why? Because I knew something was wrong in my life. I knew I needed help. I knew that I was in bondage to a lot of things, even though up until that point I really thought I was a pretty good guy. And then it was while I was in the Army and while I was in Texas and then later when I was in Hawaii that I began to realize that I'm not the guy I think I am. And I started realizing I needed help. And God was the answer. I just had to find Him. And so I began to search for Him all over. And then one day I go and my roommate, my roommate was Tommy Johns, but right across the hall was a man named Terry Burdett, and I called him Birdie back in the day. And so Birdie kept saying, are you a Christian? Every day. Every day he'd ask me, are you a Christian? And I'd say, sure I am. And then he'd ask me the next day, are you a Christian? And I'd say, sure I am. And he'd say the next day, are you a Christian? And I'd say, sure I am. But his continual questioning me began to make me wonder, what is a Christian? And so I was already looking for God, but I had never thought about the question, what is a Christian? Until he asked me every day for, a month or more. And literally every time I saw him, he'd ask me if I was a Christian. And it began to bother me. And so I started seeking God out and started searching even more. I was already searching for God, but now I wanted to know, what is a Christian? And I started to watch his life. I watched the way he interacted with people. I watched what he did when he was in the mess hall eating with the other folks. I watched what he would watch when he was down in our TV room or not there, or what books did he read. I wanted to know who this guy is. And I began to realize he was a lot different than I was. And because of that, it meant something was definitely wrong. And so that's what God is talking about here in Exodus chapter 6. These people realize that things may not always be as good as they think they are. And you say, well, but they're slaves, so of course they're in bondage. Yes, they're in bondage, but what's happening is their numbers are growing in size, and so the Egyptians are beginning to persecute them more and more because they're scared of them. Their numbers are getting so large that they're realizing that they might rise up against them, and they don't want that to happen. And that's why they've put them in bitter bondage, and why they've increased the tasks that are on them to basically keep them distracted and unable to fight back or take over or do anything like that. And honestly, isn't that what happens to us when we actually start realizing that we need God? You say, what do you mean? We start getting distracted by the things of the world. And it doesn't matter what the distraction is, as long as there is a distraction, something that keeps you from seeking the truth, from understanding the truth, from getting delivered from your bondage. And so that's what's happening to the Jews here, is they're in all of this bondage. And God says something wonderful in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 6. He says to Moses, wherefore say unto the children of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I remember that day as I was sitting in the auditorium of Colwell Baptist Church, and Brother Alan Anger, he was preaching out of Revelation chapter 19, and I believe it's verse 6, where he talks about Jesus being on the great white horse, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. And he said, my topic today is righteous judgment. And he began to talk about what it would be to stand before a holy God who can't be deceived like your friends can, can't be deceived like your coworkers can, can't be deceived like your bosses can. You say, what do you mean? Well, people can put on airs. They can put on a costume. They can be that hypocrite that deceives people. But that will never happen when we stand before a holy God. And as that preacher began to open up the Word of God and show me what true and righteous judgment was, I was honestly terrified. And I do mean terrified. I will never forget how much conviction I got under sitting in that auditorium that day. And it was a lot like our auditorium. We have seats in here. We don't have pews. We just have padded chairs in here. I can remember reaching up and grabbing the chair in front of me, and my grip got tighter and tighter and tighter as that preaching went on. And you say, why? Because I knew I was in bondage to so much. And as much as I wanted to think I was a good person, he began to list all the things that God was going to judge us for. And I began to realize that day that I really wasn't the guy I thought I was. I had a lot more sin in my life than I thought I did, even though my mom thought I was the best of all the kids. I began to realize that I really wasn't. It was just Mom chose to see certain parts of my life and not all the parts of my life. And I'm grateful for that. But God said that He's going to bring them out from under the burden of the Egyptians. I will bring you out. The idea is that they're laden down with something that's not really helping them. Because you understand that the Bible is pro-burden. You say, what do you mean? Well, I believe it's in Galatians. Is it Galatians 6, I believe, where he talks about every man shall bear his own burden. And then he talks about, just a few verses later, he says that we will bear one another's burdens, but the word used is different there. One of them's talking about that pack, that thing that we're expected to carry, but the other is talking about something that's way beyond us. And the truth is, that's the way sin is. Sin is way beyond our ability to do anything about it. It's the monkey on our back that we cannot get off. And that's why it's so important that we who understand the Scriptures and that we're believers, that we have to see those people being in the same bondage we were in. And we need to go back and remember that day when we got delivered, and that's going to cause us to have compassion and mercy on other people and say, I'm not better than them. The only difference is I'm on the other side of getting redeemed. I'm on the other side of God lifting off that heavy burden and taking it away from me. And if you've truly got born again, I do believe there's going to be a day when you look back on your former life and you'll realize how much you got delivered from. I do know that that day when I got born again, I don't know how to explain it in a way that some would understand, because some will think I'm crazy right now when I say this. But when I walked out of there, I thought I was 3 feet above the floor. And you say, why? Because I knew that God had taken the load of sin off of me. I knew I wasn't carrying it anymore. I knew I didn't have to answer for my sins anymore, that Jesus already had. And that's an amazing epiphany for a man who knew as little Bible as I did. I did know that He took it all away. I didn't even know how to explain my salvation the next day when I tried to witness to my sergeant, my Staff Sergeant Arthur Lamott III. I had no idea to tell him what happened except that God did something yesterday. And I know I'm right with Him. And I know that someday when I die, I'll be with Him. That's all I could tell him. I didn't even know anything more than that. I didn't even know any verses. I didn't know how to quote anything. I knew God so loved the world. That was about it. I knew John 3:16 only because I'd grown up in church, but I didn't know God until that day. And here God promises the Jews, I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And when you get born again, God is going to bring you out from under those things. Sometimes people ask me, how do you talk to somebody who's religious? I'll tell you how. Ask them when they got out from under the burden. Because a lot of religious people are still under the burden and they don't even acknowledge that. You say, why? Because there are churches out there that misrepresent the gospel. They'll tell them as long as you're a member in good standing, as long as you're giving, as long as you're doing these certain ordinances, as long as you're doing these certain sacraments, you're good. And that's not how it works. You accept God's gift, and He takes away the burden. It's not something that you do, it's something that He does. You receive a gift, and He takes it away. He takes away all of that burden. And so He brings us out from under. In other words, I'm no longer carrying that sin anymore. Now, by the way, as a believer, can I go back and grab that stuff up? Yes, I can. Yeah. Why? Because we have a free will. And if you have time, I recommend that you read John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, because in there he talks about that. But I love the picture when you see it in the movie format, and that big old burden keeps, every time you see him in a new scene, the burden on his back keeps getting taller, keeps getting fatter, keeps getting wider, and the next thing you know, it's almost enveloping him. And The burden of sin, by the way, in Christian's life didn't change at all in the movie. What changed was his awareness. And see, when we become aware of our sin, then it's going to change the way that we carry ourselves. It's going to change the way that we interact with that stuff. I was talking to a dear Christian this week, and they were talking about the self-hatred that they have for themselves sometimes. And I said, honestly, I do not view that maybe in the same way that you do. And you say, why? Because when we get saved, we do realize what God's done for us. And there are times when we hate what we used to be. But you have to remember that the reason why Jesus came to die for you is because you couldn't fix it. You had no way to get out from under those burdens. You had no way to correct yourself. He did it all. All to Him I owe. And so until you understand, you couldn't fix it. And when you're talking to religious people, like I say, they seem to be content with just having that air of a relationship with God without actually knowing that they're forgiven. And you say, how do you know that? Because I've talked to so many religious leaders over the years. I've talked to maybe close to 24 rabbis, and when I talk about rabbis, I'm not talking about the lesbian rabbis and those kind of people. I'm talking about Orthodox rabbis. I have witnessed to more of them than I can remember, but I've never yet found one that when I asked him, do you know for a fact when you die that you're ready to meet God? Not one of them has ever said, yep, I absolutely know that I'm ready. You say, why? Because they don't. And that's part of having a religion without knowing God. Without knowing that it's God who's going to take away that burden, without knowing that it's God who's going to give you the forgiveness, without knowing that it's God who's going to give you His righteousness. All those things are given to us of God. We can't do those things ourselves. And that's why God gave us this illustration in the lives of these Jewish people. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And then He goes on to say, and I will rid you out of their bondage. That same word is used, by the way, over in that word rid you, is over in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 19, where it says, and they said, and this is talking about the Midianite women of Jethro, and they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us and watered the flock. So that idea of being rid you out of their bondage, that means somebody coming up and going, okay, I can pull you out of this mess. Why do they have to pull you out? Because you can't do it yourself. It's overwhelming. It's beyond your ability. It's beyond your strength. It's beyond you even reasoning your way out of it. It's why some of you know that it must have been a year ago. Yeah, it was about a year ago. It was this time of year a year ago, but I got to go over to Madison, and I had never been to a, what's the thing where they give you the coins? AA. I went to my first AA meeting. And you say, why? Because a man who was going to it asked me to come and attend. I had never been to one before. And it was sad. You say, why was it sad? Because over and over again, they kept telling them that if you do this and you do that, you can get yourself out of this trouble. And I thought to myself, you don't understand the gospel. I know that people tell me that AA was started based on the gospel, but they've gotten far from it. And you say, why? Because they tell those people that are in all their sins and all their addictions that they can help themselves. It's not like that. You need a holy God who spoke the world into existence to come live inside of you. And the moment that He comes live inside of you, you now have the power to overcome things in your life. And it's only because He's giving it to you, not because you have the ability. It's because He puts that inside of your heart. He puts that burning zeal to want to be right before God, to be holy before God, to stand and live in truth before a holy God. When He puts that inside of you, yes, then things are going to change. You're going to despise the sin that dominates your life. You're going to despise the things that you know are keeping God's blessings at bay. And you're going to say, I want God's blessings. I've got to get these things out. Help me, God. And amazingly, He's going to start to deliver you from them. And as he does, there will be times that you're going to choose, even when he delivers you from them, you're not struggling with this or that. You would normally watch this program and you're not going to watch it. You'd normally read your books or your magazines or your novels, and you like those because they take you away from real life, and you're going to stop reading those. Why? Because God is giving you deliverance from them. And then one day you're going to go, yeah, but I know how good that makes me feel. Yeah, we can go back to that. But I'm telling you, the only reason that we have the power to overcome them is because of what God's done in our life. Because he is the one who is going to, as he says, he is the one who's going to bring us out from underneath that bondage. He is the one who is going to rid you out of bondage or deliver you. In other words, take those very bonds off of you and give you freedom. It also says it over in Genesis 32:11, where this is Jacob speaking. He said, "Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he will come and smite me and the mother with the children." What's he saying? Deliver me out of the hands of my brother. That's the same thing. It's the idea that you have an enemy that you can't overcome, you can't compensate for, but God says he will. He will rid you out of their hand. He will deliver you from their hand. He will bring you out of that trial, that tribulation, that sin, that difficulty, that trouble in your life that you can't do anything about. And yet God can. And that's the second way that he's going to deliver the children of Israel, he says, is I will rid you out of their bondage. But then in verse 6 he also says this, "And I will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments." And to me, of the four things that he promises to do for the Jewish people, this is probably one of my favorite ones. And you say, why? Because of the picture that's there. When he says, "I will redeem you," he's using the Hebrew word goel. Goel is the idea that we know of called a kinsman redeemer. It's not enough that he lifts off the burdens. It's not enough that he delivers us out of all troubles. We still have a problem. We stand in judgment because of our past. And we need somebody to redeem us from our past sins, our past mistakes, whatever you want to call those words. And some people like mistake because it sounds better than sin. But it's the same thing. We have transgressed against a holy God, whether we've bent out of the way, whether we've stepped over a line. As I've taught some of you, there's 8 different words that I'm aware of in the book of Exodus that talk about sin in a lot of different ways. But ultimately, they're all sin. Ultimately, they all have a consequence in our life until we're redeemed out of all of our troubles. And so the Lord says that he's coming as our kinsman redeemer. That's the term, by the way, that's used here. Let me back up in my notes because I want to say this before I forget to do it. God is choosing to be our kinsman redeemer. It is not enough that he just identifies with us and says, okay, I love those people. Because him loving us is not enough to fix the problem. He has to be willing to put himself out there and do something to deliver us, to redeem us from our sins, from our transgressions. It's not enough for him to identify with us. He must also have the wherewithal to redeem us or to buy us back from our sin, from our transgression, from our ways, because there is an ultimate judgment for everything that we've ever done or been, and somebody has to pay for it. And so over in Hosea chapter 3, a lovely, lovely story in Hosea chapter 3 where God says, "Then said the Lord unto me, Go yet love a woman, beloved of her friend, yet an adulteress, according to the love of the Lord toward the children of Israel, who look to other gods and love flagons of wine." By the way, as if you heard me talk about that term Elohim, it does mean a judge. They would rather have the judges that are not in a godly way. Those people who, although they're over the people, they're not for truth and right and good. And he says, no, there's got to be where you want what? The ultimate Elohim of the universe, the ultimate judge that actually wants truth and righteousness in the inward parts. That's who we're supposed to want, that Elohim. And so he says this, he says, "Go yet and love a woman, beloved of her friend, yet an adulteress. And it says in verse 2, so I bought her to me for 15 pieces of silver and for an omer of barley and for an half omer of barley. He's buying back his wife. He's already been married to her. She's already been unfaithful, and she's been so unfaithful and so ungodly that she's gotten herself into the situation where she's gotten herself in massive debt and had to sell herself for the sake of that debt, to pay off that debt. And now she's a slave, and they've offered her up on the auction block. And God says, I know what she's done to you, and I know how difficult the relationship's been. But I want you to go and love her. I want you to go and buy her back. I want you to go and deliver her from all of her sins. Why? Because he's demonstrating the love of God. That's why he says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. How do I explain that love? I can't. Because I know when it comes to us, when we have one of our family members or an intimate person in our family offend us or hurt us, our immediate answer is, I think I'll do something to be a blessing to them. No, that's not how the flesh responds. The flesh responds, you hurt me. I want to get you back. But that's because it's not a godly response. The godly response is shown here in Hosea, where he says, love a woman, beloved of her friend, yet an adulteress, according to the love of God to the children of Israel. So I bought her to me for 15 pieces of silver, for an omer of barley, and for a half omer of barley. Then I said unto her, thou shalt abide for me many days. Thou shalt not play the harlot, and thou shalt not be for another man. Listen to this. So will I also be for thee. Now to me that shows true love. And you say, what do you mean by true love? When you've been hurt by somebody and they've marred the relationship between you and them, you've had a strong, intimate relationship with each other, and one of them has marred it. It's really hard to not only say, I want you back, but really hard to say, and I'm going to commit to being good to you in spite of what you've done to me. And that's what God here is saying. In spite of all that you've done, I'm not only going to love you, but I'm going to commit that I'm going to be the best kind of spouse. I'm going to be the best kind of husband. I'm going to be the best kind of person that's going to walk alongside of you and be a blessing to you in spite of how you've hurt me in the past. Because I'm going to be godly. I'm going to be right. I'm going to be good to you. And so God promises that here. Over in Hosea chapter 14, he continues with this. He says, O Israel, return unto the Lord thy God, for thou hast fallen by thine iniquity. Take with you words and turn to the Lord. Of course, that word turn there is the Hebrew word shuv, which means to repent. Turn to the Lord. Say unto him, take away all iniquity and receive us graciously. So will we render the calves of our lips. Asher shall not save us. We will not ride upon horses, neither will we say any more to the work of our hands, ye are our gods. So they're already claiming, the Baal and all these other people are their gods. No, they're turning to the supreme God, the one who believes in justice, the one who believes in truth in the inward parts. And they're saying, for in thee the fatherless find what? Mercy. We're looking for mercy. And he says in verse 4, I will heal their backsliding. I will love them freely, for mine anger is turned away from him. And that's what we need. We need redemption. We need that kinsman redeemer that's going to look down upon us when we're in that bad place and say, I'm going to forgive you. I'm going to love you. And I know that's hard for us, because I know it's hard for me even. There are so many times, today as I was talking to Brother Joseph Sturtz, our evangelist, and we were just talking about his years of being a pastor, and he was talking about different things that had happened during his years as a pastor, and offenses and the things that people do to you and all that. And he said, I don't think many people, unless you've been a pastor, understand what it's like to have those very people hurt you over and over and over again, and you keep saying, I love you and I'm praying for you. But when you are a pastor, God calls you to do things that many other people may never do. But He's called you to do it. He's called you to demonstrate what it is to have the love of Christ and to say, in spite of what you've done to me, in spite of how many times you've inflicted wounds on me, I love you, I'm praying for you, I want the best for you. Is that hard to do? It is, but it's our calling. And he said, I do believe that there comes a day when God will right all those things. And he said, I do believe that there's going to be a time when, as we do those things that we know God's called us to, and to love on those people that are not always lovely, that there's going to not only be rewards for that, but he said there's also going to come a day that those who keep inflicting the wounds over and over again are going to stand before God. And they also will have to answer. And I said, that terrifies me, brother, because I know that I have not intentionally always done it, but I've hurt people, and I know I have. And I've done wrong at times, and I know I have. And I continually just say, God, forgive me, because I know that I'm not the perfect guy, but I want to walk with you. I want to walk uprightly. I want to walk in truth. I want to be those things that you want me to be. But God does that. He says He'll love them freely, for His anger is turned away from Him. So if we want to be Christ-like, that's the way we are even to the ones who wound us, the ones who hurt us. And God asked Hosea to do that with his wife, who had literally gone out to be a harlot after they'd gotten married. And I cannot imagine doing what he's done. And so when people talk about how do they do those kind of things, I'll tell you how he did it. He wasn't like the typical people where God did give a writing of divorcement, and I acknowledge there is a writing of divorcement in the Scriptures, and God gave it. Why? Because of the hardness of their hearts. We know something about Hosea, though. Hosea did not have a hard heart, or he could not have gone to Gomer, his wife, and taken her back again. And yet he did. He took her back and said, I'm going to love her. I'm going to meet her needs, and I'm going to reserve myself for her alone. Hosea did that. Over in Ruth chapter 3, very familiar passage for some of you. You know the story of Naomi had two sons, and he had daughter-in-laws that were both Moabites, and one of her daughter-in-laws was named Ruth, and it says, the mother-in-law was Ruth, the daughter-in-law was Naomi. I'm messing it up. Yeah, I'm doing it the other way around. Yeah. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said unto her, My daughter, shall I not seek rest for thee, that it may be well with thee? Now, the reason why this is happening is because her husband has passed away. Naomi's son has passed away, and so Ruth is without a spouse. And in that society, realized that women didn't own land. They didn't own things. They certainly could work, they could be married, etc., but they couldn't own land. And so she needed somebody to help her, because she was at great loss. And it says in verse 2, And now is not Boaz of our kindred, with whom whose maidens thou wast? Behold, he winnoweth barley tonight in the threshing floor. Wash thyself therefore, and anoint thee, and put thy raiment upon thee, and get thee down to the floor, but make not thyself known unto the man until he have done eating and drinking. It shall be, when he lieth down, thou shalt mark the place where he shall lie. Thou shalt go in and uncover his feet, and lay thee down, and he will tell thee what thou shalt do. And she said unto her, All that thou sayest unto me I will do. And she went down unto the floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law bade her. Now imagine, she could have said, I'm not doing that, Mom. I don't know who this person is. I don't know anything about them. My only duty is to you. I'll take care of you. But we don't need to worry about my future. We don't need to worry about this strange man. She could have refused all these things. But she trusted her mom. There was something in her mother-in-law that caused her to have faith in God. And when her mother-in-law told her this is what would be best for you, she was willing to trust that mother-in-law who, in spite of her bitterness over her situation and losing her two sons, had enough godliness that Ruth wanted it. She wanted to be like her mother-in-law. And she says, all that you've said, I will do it. I will do all those things. Realize she's in a strange land. She's in strange customs, and yet she's accepting things at face value. If you say this is best for me, Mom, I accept that, and I will do those things. And so, it says, when Boaz, in verse 7, had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of corn, and she came softly and uncovered his feet and laid her down. It came to pass at midnight that the man was afraid and turned himself, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, "Who art thou?" And she said, "I am Ruth, thine handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman." And he said, "Blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter, for thou hast showed more kindness in the latter end than at the beginning. Inasmuch as thou followest not young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, fear not, I will do to thee all that thou requirest. For all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman." Now, by the way, I find another picture here interesting. And you say, what is that? He just called her an Isheth Hayil, a woman of virtue. What did she still need? She still needed a kinsman redeemer. I don't care how righteous you think you are. You still need a kinsman redeemer, according to this picture. Everybody needs a kinsman redeemer. The Pharisee needs a kinsman redeemer. The person who sells in the souks needs a kinsman redeemer. The tax collector needs a kinsman redeemer. Everybody needs a kinsman redeemer. Even this woman who's called an Isheth Hayil, which is a high honor to have that title put next to your name. And yet she still needed that kinsman redeemer. And it goes on to say, "And now it is true that I am thy near kinsman, howbeit there is a kinsman nearer than I. Tarry this night, and it shall be in the morning that if he will perform unto thee the part of a kinsman, well, let him do the kinsman part. But if he will not do the part of a kinsman to thee, then will I do the part of kinsman to thee. As the Lord liveth, lie down until the morning." When we jump over to chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "Then Boaz went up to the gate and sat him down there, and behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by." And I don't have to explain to you guys, but this was true always in every city in Israel during these times of the ancient Near East, and that is the gateways into a city were always very narrow. The ones that I have visited have never been more than about 12 to 14 feet wide at most. That's after you get through where the gate is. There's usually seats made out of stone all the way around two of the walls on the outer edge. They always forced you when you would come into a gate either to turn to the left or to the right. And so you'd have this wall, and you'd have this wall with seats, or you'd have this wall and this wall with seats. But what they would do was transact business inside the gates of the city. And so there would always be people there that were known in the community as being honest and upright. Those were the ones that would usually pass judgment on anything that you needed to know. They would know all the cultures and customs of the day. They would know what's right and wrong, how things should be transacted. And so he goes there to the gate. He waits for that particular kinsman redeemer that has the right to buy back the land of Ruth and be able to give it to her. Now realize that for a kinsman redeemer, they might think that's a plus, that they could buy back the land. You say, why? Because if they buy it for them, it's now technically part of their land. But as we continue to read this story, it says here, he saw the kinsman redeemer come, unto whom he said, Ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. And as he turned aside and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, Sit ye down here. And they sat down. And he said unto the kinsman, Naomi, that has come out of the country of Moab, selleth a parcel of land, which was our brother Elimelech's. And I thought to advertise thee, saying, Buy it before the inhabitants and before the elders of my people. If thou wilt redeem it, redeem it. But if thou wilt not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know. For there is none to redeem it beside thee, and I am after thee. In other words, you have first position to buy this. And he said, I will redeem it. So he's all excited. He's got this chance to buy land, and the guy, one of his relatives, told him about this chance to buy land. But what does he do in the very next verse? He said, Then said Boaz, What day thou buyest the field of the hand of Naomi, thou must buy it also of Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. Now the one thing I think Boaz knew here is that many people make their decisions based on the flesh. And Boaz, we know, was a godly person. And you say, how do we know that? Because when he went out to the works, out to his workers out there in the field, he always made sure everybody was taken care of, made sure everything was upright, told the men to leave the women alone that were gathering of whatever was left behind. We also know that he would say something along the lines of, "The Lord bless you." We know that he was a religious man that loved the Lord. But to me, the greatest way that we know it is, here is a man who's willing to mar his own inheritance to show the love of God. And you say, what do you mean to mar his own inheritance? He's going to pay for the land, but it's not going to be his kids that are going to get to, technically it's not going to be his other kids that are going to get to be the blessing of the land. It's going to be whatever kids he might have with Ruth. So that's why it would be considered marring your inheritance, and yet he's willing to do that. He's willing to take her as a wife. He's willing to buy the land and allow her kids to grow up on it, not necessarily other kids that he no doubt already has. Why is that? Because he has the love of God. And he's willing to be that kinsman redeemer that's going to do something for somebody else that may not favorably help me in my financial or business situations. Realize that part of being a Christian is being willing to do that. Doing financial decisions that may not always bless you or help you. Think about how many times that people come into your lives and you say to yourself, well, if I do this for them or load them this money or give them this thing, what does it do for me? See, that's how the flesh works. But when you have God working in your life, there's going to be times when you're going to say, just as God's been good to me and given me things that I don't deserve, there's going to be times when he might lead you to do things for others that don't deserve it. Helping other people, doing other things for them. I've had people in the past who called me Satan. Literally called me Satan. And I did things to help them in spite of the fact that they were calling me such things. And you say, why? Because it's sometimes what the Lord may have you to do. Because when we're following God and we're not following the leadership of this flesh, we're going to stop worrying about what do they think or what does somebody else think. We're going to be a lot more concerned about what does God think. And then trying to please God with those decisions and those actions that we make. The wonderful thing is someday we'll get to stand before the Lord and it'll get to be found out whether we did it the right way or not. And if we're being submissive to God, it will come out. It will come out that we're doing what God wanted us to do. And that in spite of the names that others may have called us, it's not going to matter, because he's going to rectify all that stuff when he comes back for us. And so here, it says in verse 10, "Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, have I purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren and from the gate of his place. You are witnesses this day." And all the people that were in the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. The Lord make the woman that is come into thine house like Rachel and like Leah." And they say, why do they say that? Because, of course, they had a ton of kids. He says, "Which did build the house of Israel, and do thou worthily in Ephratah, and be famous in Bethlehem." Now that's what the people were crying out. What ultimately did come of this union? The Messiah came through this union. And where did he come from? Where was he born? Y'all know that. Even though they weren't from this area at the time, what did God do? He brought back the Messiah, who his family was living up in a town called Nazareth. And they came back because their home area was actually Bethlehem. And they come back there and they give birth to the Messiah. The Messiah is descended through this woman and through this man who was willing to do the right thing, to be that kinsman redeemer, which is what we need. We need a kinsman redeemer. Everybody on this earth needs a kinsman redeemer, somebody that's going to look down upon them and say, "I love you and I'm going to do what's best for you." Regardless of how other people are treating me or treating you, that all doesn't matter. I'm going to do right. I'm going to do right. And so he becomes the kinsman redeemer. And then, of course, I didn't, that's right. I printed out another page that's upstairs, which means that I'm just supposed to end the sermon now. My last page is still upstairs. That's funny. But he promised, and I can read it to you in the Bible anyway, even though I don't have the paper down here with me. He says that he will bring you out from under the burdens. He says he will rid you out of their bondage. He says he will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments. And then lastly, he says in verse 7, and I will take you to me for a people. Of course, that take you to me a lot of times is talking about like a marriage relationship, taking a person to yourself and saying, you're going to become part of my family. You're going to become very unique and special to me. You're going to have privileges above what everybody else has is because I'm choosing you. And in that same manner, God takes us to himself and brings us into that covenant relationship, which is why we're called the bride of Christ. Because he's taking us to himself, and there's someday when we're going to go up to be with God, and we're going to be at that marriage supper of the Lamb, where God is going to consummate that marriage. We're going to have a feasting of 7 days, and we're going to rejoice in what God's done for us. He's going to give us new bodies. He's going to give us an inheritance, things that we never got to see on this earth. We are going to see someday when we're with him where he is at. And I hate to say heaven because I don't know if the Bible's that clear about what the title of it is called, but I know that it's wherever he is, we'll be with him. And we are going to receive those things because of that relationship we came into with that kinsman redeemer who loved us in spite of who we are, who loved us and while we were yet sinners, that he died for us. And so we could get into more there, but I think we're going to stop right there. Thank you for joining us online.